And welcome back to the Young Dad Podcast. Whether you're outside grilling, changing dirty diapers, coaching Little League, outside mowing the lawn, whatever you're at, whatever you're doing, thanks for tuning in. And thanks for taking a moment to be with us. I'm your host, Jay, and super excited to be with you as always. Today's guest is Dr. David Marcus, a clinical psychologist with over 40 years of experience helping families build stronger emotional connections, even in the middle of stress, conflict, or chaos. He's here to talk about how we can improve the way we talk to and listen to our children. His strategies are practical, powerful, and rooted in decades of real-world family support. So, if you're ready for a great conversation on how you can better connect with your kids, talk to your kids, and of course, listen as well, this podcast is for you. So make sure you grab a juice box, grab a snack, and let's jump into it. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jay.
Of course, super excited to have you. So, before we jump into all the meat and potatoes of the conversation, can you kind of take us through what got you into this field originally?
Ironically, I'll start with that. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh in psychology, but I actually avoided doing the clinical courses. I was more interested in the research courses. So I graduated from there with a bachelor's in psychology, and I got a job doing research in, believe it or not, neuroendocrinology, which is effect of hormones on the brain. I did a 3-year study that turned out to be very successful that I presented at a convention in New York. I was very scared because I was only 24 years old, but I was our first author on this fairly prestigious paper. And then I decided, you know, um, I need more people contact in this. I was working in a lab. And I said, oh, okay, let me see if I want to do more of the clinical end of psychology. And so I volunteered at a state hospital near Philadelphia. And from that work, I went to work with a patient in Philadelphia. And finally, I decided this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with kids and adults, and I wanted to work with families. And so I applied to graduate school and went to the University of Louisville for my PhD in clinical psychology. And I found it very creative. All right. It's doing psychotherapy, in-depth psychotherapy with families under stress, which is what I specialize in. I find every person, every family is unique. And so you need to be creative and never think that you really know exactly what's going on, because as soon as you do that, you start getting formulaic. You need to meet each family where they need to be. So the creativity part of it is one of the things that's really kept me going, and also living with the knowledge that you never are going to really know. So you keep exploring, and that's what I say with the people that I see. We're going to go on a mutual exploration for the things that you're coming to me with, because most people come to me and say, I'm doing this and I don't know why. I feel this way and I don't know why. I should be doing this, but I'm not and I don't know why. These are the kind of questions I get. So we have to basically find the words for what's going on. How come they're doing these things or not doing these things or feeling how they are? And when you deal with families under stress, you're dealing with a whole family system of people. So I never see children without seeing their parents. I'm very aware that I am not the agent of change when I see a family under stress. The parents are. And so I try to help them develop what I call a soothing presence. And what is a soothing presence? Well, in its simplest form, soothing presence is somebody who is okay when you're not okay. When we think about the people that we turn to when we're upset or feeling something intensely, we pick certain people, friends or family, usually not many, but invariably the people that we pick are people who are okay when we're not okay. Well, the reason I use the term soothing presence rather than soothing person is because in order to be that person who's okay when your children are not okay, uh, you need to have the environment that supports you. And that's one of the things I often have to talk to parents about is lifestyle, for instance. There's a lot of side stress on families these days, two-income families, the finances, etc. And that can make it very difficult to be a soothing presence for your children. So we talk about that as well. There's a lot to that because what we're talking about is when people get very stressed, they have a tendency to what's called regress. And what I mean by that is they regress to older ways of dealing with things. And with parents, it's typically how they were raised. Okay, one of the things that is important to understand is something called internalization. And what do I mean by that? Internalization is almost like subliminal learning. Sort of, we learn things under our level of awareness. A good example in a sociological level would be prejudice. It's not like somebody at the age of 17 tells you you're going to start hating black people or Asian people, because by that time you've had enough experience in your own life to say, and wait a minute, why would I do that? You know, but at the age of 4 and 5 and 6, and you hear the jokes or you see the reactions and things, it gets in there. It gets in there. And one of the things, reason I bring up that internalization and regression is because one of the things that children pick up from their parents is how to react to stress. Okay. So if your parents are understanding and they talk things out, then okay, that's what you'll probably do as you grow up too. And if you get stressed, that's where you may regress to. But families that, for instance, parent gets angry or even physical, when they get stressed, well, then that child picks that up. And this is one of the reasons why children who are abused and when they grow up and they become parents, they'll swear that they never do what happened to them to their own children. But under stress, especially excuse me, unanticipated stress, that causes the greatest regression, of course. We're not expecting it. And children are marvels at giving us unanticipated stress. So all of a sudden they find themselves and they start to hit. And this is how there's a legacy of abuse across generations. So it's important for parents to learn the skills of how to be a soothing presence, what that entails, but it also means the environment and being very aware of where they may regress to under stress. Now,
Interesting.
yeah.
No, it's
So go ahead. No, no, no. If you have a question, please, or a comment.
oh no, I was gonna comment because I was actually just having this conversation yesterday because I don't really let it be known too often on the podcast here, but I also work. Well, actually, I do pretty often. I work in mental health and behavioral health as well. And I
Mhm.
was having a parent group last night, a group of parents, and we were talking about just this very thing because two of the parents in that, well, I guess technically, yeah, three of the parents actually have a child with autism, and we were talking about that mirroring right there, right? About how they'll do exactly what their parents will do when it comes to handling the different emotional situations and talking about stress or talking about just even empathy or how kind they are. And then talking directly to a couple of the dads that were there with the children with autism and one without. It was like your boys are more likely gonna do exactly what you do than what mom does. Like you have an incredibly strong influence on your boys as well. And we got really deep into that conversation. It was really impactful. But that was just kids across the board, like you're talking about here, to where they the way that they learn is by watching, right? They watch what we do as parents, and they learn what we're doing as parents, and that's what they're going to do as well. So how you handle things, even if you don't lash out at people physically, if you're lashing out at people verbally, that can give them the cue to, okay, well, this is how dad handles it, so that's how I'm gonna handle it. Because if he's doing it, it must be okay, kind of thing. Because my dad does everything, essentially right. So dad does it, it's okay, or mom does it, that's okay for me to then do the same thing.
No, that's exactly what I'm speaking. No, where I'm extending it a little bit, Jay, is the fact that even when you're grown, these things are inside you. It's not you're just not reacting like when you're a child. You see dad react and you react the same way. The child who grows up reacts the way dad did, you see. And it's like this internalized thing. It's almost subliminal. They may regret it later. You know what I mean? I try to make parents aware that this is where they can go. And oftentimes the parents go in two different places, and sometimes that leads to arguments about how to parent.
Yeah,
See?
because both parents come from a different place,
Right, and they've internalized different responses.
and so they're
You know,
both
this
trying to fix those responses for that child. But I mean, we don't know. None of us know how. We don't know how to do that naturally.
well, that's where the next part of our conversation is going to go, to tell you the
Hmm.
truth. How do you find out how? You know, how do you figure out what to do? The parents. When I talk to parents as a psychologist, they're bringing their child in to see me, and it's because they've tried everything they know,
Hmm.
and they've gotten advice from other people, things like that, and it's not working. So they're coming to somebody like me saying, "Okay, what do I do?" And they're very afraid I'm going to turn to them and go, "Oh, you're really messing up with your children." Obviously, I'm never going to say that to parents, but that's what they're afraid of. So I talk about it in terms of we'll do a mutual exploration, like I said, but also what I'm going to be doing with you is tweaking the parenting skills you already have. We're going to fine tune some things. It's a way of approaching it to sort of empower them to say, okay, you can make a difference. And I tell them, me as a treating therapist, I am not the agent of change. You are. I am temporary. I see your child once a week, once every couple of weeks. It's not going to make the difference. I never see children without seeing their parents because they are really the agents of change, and that's where the change has to be. That's why I consider myself a family therapist rather than just a child therapist or an adult. It's a totally different animal doing work with children and families than it is doing work with adults. It just is. There's so much more to consider. I guess I should go through these so that you can understand what I mean when I get to the part about emptying out and filling out. Okay. When parents, they make certain assumptions about their children, and I call them the assumptions of emotionality. And this is what I talk about in a book that I'm trying to get published even as we speak. And these assumptions are developmental in nature. And they go like this. They start with the earliest one. And the first assumption that parents make about their children is that the child experiences their emotions. Well, this is a pretty safe assumption to make. Children know when they're mad, when they're sad, etc. So that one's okay. And it's a very good thing that that is the case because it's only in the situations of early serious abuse and neglect that the child will actually divorce themselves from their emotions. In 40 years of practice, I've only seen two children like this, and it was scary. Why? These children could not play. Children's approach to reality is through play. They buffer reality through fantasy. They play at being mommy. They play at being daddy. But obviously they can't handle the rigors of adult stresses, etc. So they do it through play. A child who can't play has been impinged upon so greatly that they won't experience their emotions, and it's so rare. And it's a very good thing it is rare because who I'm describing to you is Hannibal the cannibal, somebody who could do something horrific and feel nothing. Thank goodness that's a very rare thing. And obviously, as a psychologist in private practice with parents who are concerned, that's not what I'm going to see very often. But the next one up, the developmental ladder. Okay, the child experiences their emotions. Can they tolerate the intensity of their emotions? Now, that's an assumption you cannot make. Young children, are you a parent, Jay? I'm not sure. Are you a parent?
I am. Yep. I think it'd be kind of weird to do a podcast about being a dad, not be a dad. So
Well, that's true. Excuse me. That's true.
it's
Well,
weird
okay.
too because it's like I look at like guests and things like that, and I'm like, well, I want people to relate, and I have like I found myself starting to have a hard time where it's like, well, I don't know if it's gonna resonate as well. Like this is gonna sound really wrong too, but I've said other stuff on the podcast that will probably get me canceled way faster than this will. But like women who are like experts on men, it's like, well, yeah, you could very well be an expert on men, but I believe the men I'm talking to in general, just my reaction to hearing that is like, oh, I'm gonna turn this off and go to the next podcast like immediately because I want to hear a man who's an expert about men talking to men about men. I don't really wanna hear that coming from a woman because then I feel like there's some implicit bias and things like that there. And so but yeah, no, I'm a dad. I have 2 young children. I became a dad when I was super young. So,
Well, I'm a parent too, obviously.
yes,
I couldn't do the work that I do without being so now my son's grown. Obviously, I'm an older man than you are. I mean, how old are your children?
my children are 7 and 4.
Well, this will obviously be applicable to you and as a young father. I'm going to continue with these assumptions, if I may. The next one up the developmental ladder, as I said, the child has their emotions. Can they tolerate the intensity of them? Now, you're a parent of young children. You know children experience their emotions very intensely. They can be intensely gleeful about the little toy that you give them or throw a temper tantrum. And that can happen within 5 minutes of one another. I mean, and children can't tolerate how intense their emotions are. And I can explain to you why they can't. As an adult, we have a wealth of experience where we can take what's going on right now and say, okay, relating it to what I already have been through, this is better than this and worse than that, and this is how I handled it the last time, etc. Children don't have that wealth of experience. They can't relate to something previously. And so they experience these things in their original intensity. And so I've had like a 3-year-old in my office, and I'd ask him a question. I don't remember the question, which I remember this little girl would go like this. She could not tolerate hearing even the question that I was asking because it brought back the intensity of her emotions. So, one of the goals, obviously, in being a soothing presence is how do you help a child to be able to deal with the intensity of their emotions? Because if they're overwhelmed, they're going to shut down and they're not going to talk to you. So, let's go up that ladder a little further. They have their emotions, they can tolerate the intensity of the emotions. Do they have the emotional language to express it verbally? Now, a lot of parents make an assumption about that. My child is a very bright child, ergo, the silent assumption is they have a good emotional language. No, it's a totally different skill. It's how the parents help the child to develop an emotional language. And actually, one of the things that I talk about in the book is not just develop an emotional language, but develop an emotional language that's where the words have a common meaning between the parent and the child. All right. That's a little different. Parents typically assume that the word, well, okay, that my child is mad. I know what mad feels like. Well, they may be correct that the child feels it the same way, but they won't explain it the same way. And the idea is how to be communicated. They need to find words that the child would use to describe their anger, for instance. I'll give you some examples. I have one boy who would talk to me about being angry at his mom. And I say, okay, if we had to find a word for how mad you are, oh, she makes me volcano mad. I thought that was a great one. I always remembered that one, volcano mad. With little children, they'll, instead of using words, they'll, how mad does it make you? This mad, this mad, this mad, this, they spread their hands
Mhm,
out. And it's amazing to me that little children can actually touch their hands behind their back. I think it would break our scapula if we try to touch our hands behind
probably.
our back. Volcano mad, you know, you, as big as the universe, sad, Dr. Marcus, and with this boy with the volcano mad, okay, that was as mad as he gets. I said, what makes you only a little mad? Well, like when mom makes me eat my peas. Okay, I don't like peas. So from then on, what I would say, okay, he'd bring up something that made me mad, and I'd say, okay, is that volcano mad or eat your peas mad? And he'd smile at this big because I was relating it to his words, not mine.
Mhm,
So what parents typically do is, oh, you're angry. They'll go into their own experience and tell them how they handled it, like Misery Loves Company, and just do it this way and you won't be mad anymore. No, that doesn't work. I wish it did. It would make my job and your job a lot easier, but it doesn't work. Parents will explain to their children, no, just do this and you'll feel well better. A child, because they're a child, as an adult, if you try to talk to somebody about what was troubling you and they went into that, you'd probably say, just hear me out, you know. But a child isn't going to say that. You're big and they're little. They're just go, uh-huh. And you think you've got it nailed until the next thing happens that's similar and the child's just as upset as they were. I thought we talked about this. No, not really. You talked at them. and they got quiet. Okay, so that's how do the parents need to learn how to develop a common emotional language with their children. The last one, the last assumption, the child has their emotions, can handle the tolerate the intensity, and they have a language. The last one's big with teenagers. Is it safe for me to tell my parent how I feel? Now that one is based on the history the child has with the parent in trying to express themselves. Now, you're shaking your head. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm
Mhm.
sure you see a lot of this. And so if any of those assumptions prove to be false, the child's not going to communicate with you. They'll say, I don't know, or they'll change the subject. Sometimes they'll get mad at you even asking them to put you on the defensive so you get off the topic. There's all kinds of ways children can. The little girl who put her hands over her ears. I mean, there's all kinds of ways. They'll defend themselves, denial. You spilled the milk. I saw you. No, I didn't. It's simple primitive defenses. The adult version of all this is what we call repression. We know something's bothering us, but we don't want to talk about it. It's not safe to talk about it. You know, you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're getting at here. An easy way to talk about that is just like what's your track record, right? What's your track record that you have with your kids,
Mhm.
like to them, and both ways. What's that two-way track record? Is it a track record that suggests that you're open to the conversation, that you'll listen, that you'll be supportive, or is the track record that you'll be avoidant, that you'll be shutting them down, that you'll be, unsupportive? Like what's your track record with them and vice versa to make them
Mhm.
want to come to you? Because they ultimately they want to, but they'll find another way. They'll find someone else to do it if they feel like they don't need to tell you, kind of thing. Like you'll be the last option. You're like, oh well, I got no one else, and that's where the trouble comes in. And that's where other people can get to your children before you have a greater influence than you can as a parent, which is not great. But I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, that was because of your own shortcomings that you have to admit and own up to.
That's a really good point. It breaks down into two areas. And again, they're developmental in nature. With young children, they want to be able to communicate with you. Do they have the language? Do they feel that you listen? And ironically, there's ways that parents can make it unsafe for their children to talk to them that are very subtle sometimes. There's obvious ones. If the parent gets angry and defensive, if the child tries to talk to them, the child will shut down. Anybody would. Sometimes parents try to divert their child. Let's not talk about that. Let's, go watch a movie or whatever. Sometimes they'll make fun of it or make light of it, or they'll give them a platitude. Well, everything, life's hard or something like that. The one that really surprises people, Jay, is the one where I tell parents as a child psychologist, family psychologist, I really wish I could get rid of the parenting term, make feel better. When you try to make your child feel better, what you typically do is what some of the things that we're talking about, you know, and it wouldn't, I tell parents, if somebody did that with you, try to divert you, just say, hey, don't worry about it, or, whatever, give you a platitude. Would that make you feel any better? And of course they say no. But we do it with our children all the time in the name of trying to make them feel better. What they really need, and this is the topic that we're getting into now, is how do we empty out a child? How do we make them feel safe? How do we develop a language with them? How do we deal with their intensity so they can deal with their intensity? All these things go into this emptying out process. And in order to explain that, I have to explain the first term, which is being filled up, right? Obviously, you're going to empty out something. What's filling them up? That's the obvious thing, the logical thing to talk about. Well, what happened? Well, this is how I explain it, and I'll explain it here too. We all have an emotional space within us. We always point to our chest, our heart when we talk about our emotions, but obviously it's a psychological space in our brain, emotional associations. And this space gets filled up with intense emotion. It could be anxiety, it could be stress in little children, like I said earlier, it could be intense glee. It's the intensity of the emotion that fills us up. Now, what I'm trying to explain here is what happens when we get filled up. Well, it's uncomfortable. We know when we're filled up as adults because we have words to describe it, phrases that describe it, like I've had it up to here, the straw that broke the camel's back. There's a number of them. We're aware when we're filled up as adults. Children are aware too. But as adults, what do? Well, we focus inwardly and try to cope with how our intense emotions. They feel intense. Sometimes we feel they're chaotic, or like we're not in control of our emotions. And that can be scary. So we try to deal with them. And how do we do that? There's 100 different ways. We can journal. We can get it off our chest with somebody else. We can, go watch TV and get our mind off it. Go for a run. You know what I mean? There's all kinds of things we do to relieve the intensity of our emotions. So the point I'm trying to make is when somebody is filled up, they are focused inwardly to try to cope with their own. So by definition, they're not focused outwardly on what people are saying to them. The best example I can give you, at least the most graphic example that I can give you, Jay, is if you've ever seen somebody in a rage. Maybe you've heard the term a blinding rage. Have you ever heard that term, a blinding rage?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. That's true. When somebody is so filled up with anger, they're pretty much blind to anything that's going on around them. You can give them the most logical explanation for why they shouldn't feel the way it is, or it's not that bad, and they're not going to hear it. They'll hear that 5% that somehow supports their rage, or somehow your tone of voice that supports their rage. And the person who's trying to be logical, to explain things, scratches their heads and say, what's going on here? I can't talk to you. And now we've got a wall developing between parents, for instance. I can't talk to you. They don't understand it. At first, if a person's going to actually hear what they have to say, they have to be emptied out first. And that's a skill that we're going to talk about right now. A lot of it is familiar. Active listening, Thomas Gordon from way back in the 60s and 70s, sure, but there's a lot more to it than that. It gets back into the soothing presence. Your state of mind is very important when you're trying to empty out somebody, especially children. Children are exquisitely aware of how their parents feel. You can pick up an infant, and if you're tense, they will cry. Children are, they react to how you feel. So you've got to be in a good place to do this, which again, we get into the soothing presence and a lifestyle. And, it's very difficult these days to not be impinged upon by the environment, let's put it that way, and feel stressful. But that's what's necessary. So when you empty out somebody, that's a child. To soothe a child, it really depends on their age. Like, for instance, with an infant, your words aren't going to mean much. You're going to hold them and coo to them and things like that. And that's going to soothe them, the warmth of your body. As they get older, you start to do it with words and your tone of voice and your body language, basically. Child can be upset. I'm still here for you. I'm okay. The idea is that if you're okay, your child can sort of borrow your okayness. So you're not getting defensive. And the hardest part is when the child's saying, you did this and you did that. But what you want to do is defend yourself, which is not going to be helpful. It's too logical. And I'm going to explain that right now, why it's too logical. When you empty out somebody by mirroring back what they say, and when I mean a mirror, I mean exactly a mirror. You don't sum up. You don't give your own spin. You can repeat their words to them so they know that, and you keep body contact so they know they're really listening, that you're really listening. When you do that in a soothing way, in a calm way, child feels like you're really listening to them and you're taking them seriously. And that is the basis of most of therapy, to tell you the truth. When a person feels like they're truly listened to and taken seriously, that gives them the hope that things can be better. That's part of the motivation for following through in therapy. It's the same way with what we're talking about. So the thing that your parents and actually spouses or just any emotional relationship needs to understand that when you empty out somebody by being a good mirror and validating how they feel, even if you don't understand why they feel the way they do. Phrases like, based on how you see it, no wonder you feel the way you do. Where you're not exactly agreeing with them, but they feel like you're honoring their perception. But the thing to understand is there's actually three levels of emotionality that need to be emptied out, not one. Most of us try to stay on the what I call the here and now level, which is the obvious level. I use a simple example to explain this. I'll give it. Okay, you need to take out the garbage. Now we have a lot of words to describe logically why you should take out the garbage. It's beginning to smell, it's your chore, easy. Okay. The next level, deeper level, and where more of the intensity of the reaction comes in, is the history level. This is the sixth time I've asked you to take out the garbage, and you haven't done it. Now, obviously, the sixth time, the person's reaction is going to be more intense. But if you were an outsider looking in and you didn't know the history, you'd look to that person and go, well, wait a minute, what's the big deal? So they didn't take out. The deepest level is what I call the tapped into level. The fact that you didn't take out the garbage when I asked you 6 times already means that you don't listen to me. I hate when people don't listen to me. My parents didn't listen to me, and I hated that. And this one can go anywhere, all right, in a person's emotional history. Well, people try to keep arguing logically on level one, the here and now, and it just infuriates the people because they're not getting to the deeper levels. You know when you're emptying out, the person who's listening, the soothing presence, that knows they're emptying out on the history level. When the person starts talking like it, you always do this, so you never do that. Now they're referring to previous events. Now you can even elicit that as a soothing presence. Have I done that before? Has that happened before? What was it like then? You know, the deepest level is what I just described. I hate when my parents did this. Well, tell me about that. Well, they did it this way and they did it this, and then my aunt did this, and this one can go anywhere. And it's very important to get to that because sometimes, for instance, what a child is reacting to may not be what you think they're reacting to. And that's why it's necessary to go to this level because, for instance, I had a child who was very upset and sad because, he was being teased on the bus. And the parents said, well, they'll eventually stop and stuff like that, all this kind of stuff. But what he was really upset about was that his best friend was sitting next to him and his best friend joined in with the teasing. And that was the thing that was so hard for him. But if the parents were just jumping in too early and giving him a solution, but he was really not so. He was sad that his best friend was doing this. That was what he was really reacting to. So, that this is a skill and it takes a presence of mind to do it. By the end of the emptying out process, when the parent can mirror back to the child, this is what happened. I understand. This is what it was like. I understand why you were so upset about it. What can we do about this? And notice the we. It's a merger. Not, oh, what are you going to do about it? But what are we going to do? But by that time, the child is emptied out. Now they can actually speak about a possible solution. You can go back to the logical, constructive part. Parents skip the emptying out part, and the child's not ready to hear it. Same thing with the spouse. Men's from Mars, women from Venus. I don't want to get into stereotypes, but men do seem to have a tendency to want to fix things. So they'll jump in and say, hey, let's do this, making that silent assumption that if we just do this, my spouse will feel all better. It doesn't work that way. I wish it did. You and I would be unemployed if it worked that way. It'd be so simple to do this type of thing, but it's not simple. And this is the creative part of it. Like I said, everybody's different. Every child is different. All our experiences are different. We relate to our world through our experiences, especially our emotional experiences, and they're not the same. Helping people to find the words for these types of things is really the key. I feel this way and I don't know why. Well, let's try to do this mutual exploration. We'll find the words for it. And once they understand what's really going on, then what can we do to make it any better? With children, where do you start? With young children, you have to develop the emotional language first. You got to help them with their intensity first. You got to make it safe for them first, which is why adult work and child work is vastly different, because you have to consider child development. You're also realizing that you're not the agent of change, it's the parents, and the parents' environment has an impact. All the things that I've just mentioned, you know, it's a big lump, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
There's just a lot that has to, you have to take all ends and go toward the middle,
Mhm.
which is why I never see children without seeing their parents, except in the cases of like abuse or something like that sometimes, but that's the exception to the rule. But yeah. So that's the emptying out, the filled up phenomenon, if you will, the emptying out part, the regressive part, the internalization part. All of this gets pretty complicated, but it's also very creative, you know. Mhm.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job there breaking it all down and, you know, even though it can seem like a very complex thing here, it's rather simple, like you said, you go back to your assumptions, you eliminate your assumptions, and then you start or not eliminate them, but you start working through those assumptions, right? Okay, you take a step back and say, are they do we actually have a language here? What is actually going on? And we start to address those assumptions instead of just leaving them as assumptions.
Mhm.
Because if you just leave them as assumptions, thinking you know when you don't know, then you're going to be no better for it. And when someone's ready to calm down, they're ready to calm down. But when someone's ready to calm down, they'll be ready to calm down, but not before then. You have to be ready. You have to be, like you're saying here, emptied out of all those other
Mhm.
emotions and all those other, feelings and that body stress and that energy to be able to think logically because your brain's in a frenzy. You know, you're
Mhm.
not able to think
Your emotional
logically.
space is filled up. That's just a term I use, but you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then especially for our kids, like their space is so much smaller. Right? So
That's
and
true.
if there's chaos going on in their space is significantly smaller than ours, and so they don't have the capacity for it. And so you try to throw logic into that equation, then it's gonna blow everything up even more because they just don't have the room for it. They don't have the capacity for that. At least not
No,
until they're emptied out a little bit.
no, they have to empty out a lot. That's the
Yeah.
thing. You really got to empty them out because if you cut in too quickly or sum up too quickly, all that kind of thing, they're not done. And so this is important because there's so many things that you can really help a child to mature emotionally if you can take on the role of the soothing presence and the child feels safe to talk to you about peer pressure. You can help the child with peer pressure if children who do not have a soothing presence and finally give up on their parents as somebody they can talk to. Who do they turn to? Especially teens. Who do they turn to?
They turn
Other
to
teens.
yeah, other teens, which is the worst thing, or they turn to more than likely someone that you're not gonna agree with, that will counteract your personal family values, that will go against how you've been trying to raise them for the last who knows how many
Well,
years. Or they'll turn to Doctor Internet, Doctor
yeah,
TikTok, and Doctor Google, and all these
Dr.
things,
AI
and
now.
yeah, and they'll be captured, in essence, right?
Yeah. Well,
You know,
typically they'll turn to other teenagers who are in the same boat they're in. They can't talk to their parents either. And, you put enough of them together, the adolescent brain does not make really good decisions, as we know. And so what you have is the beginning of what could turn into a gang. You just don't want that, And so it's very important. And, the ironic part, I'll tell you the ironic part is mothers will come into me with their daughter who is very upset and acting out. And the mother will say to me, I don't understand it. We are so close. We're more like sisters than mother and daughter. And I know what the problem is right away. She doesn't need a sister. She needs a mother. You know what I mean? And then we get all back into what I just said. So there's a lot of subtlety to some of these things. And you're right, they'll turn to people that you don't approve of or one of the good things about being the soothing presence is you help the child to assert their own values. And that's what helps them to deal with the peer pressure. You can turn to them. Their best friend did something dumb. They went to a party, got drunk, and got in a car accident, or something. And if you lecture your child, your teenager, about, oh, your friend was bad, I don't think you should hang out with this person, they're going to defend their friend.
Mhm.
First of all, telling a teenager what they should and shouldn't do, teenager perceives that as you're treating them like a child, and they're not going to tolerate it because they want to be seen as growing up. So, they're going to fight you. And they're going to fight, this is my best friend. But rather, if you have this relationship, you say, what do you make of what your friend did? If a child feels safe enough, this teenager, excuse me, well, I think it was kind of dumb. What do you mean it was dumb? Well, this, and they real, because they got into trouble, all that kind of thing. Okay, how would you have done it differently? You see, now they're going to express their own values. Well, I don't think I would have done it that way. I don't think I would have gone to the party. I think I would have, when Bobby offered, my friend, a joint, I don't think I would have done that. You know, why not? You see, well, I don't think that's a good idea. How come? And here's the rub here. As Shakespeare would say, if a child teenager can go through that with you, I say, well, how would you have done it? Oh, I wouldn't have gone to the party, or I would have said no. And the fact that you can think it through that way really shows me that you're growing up. And that's exactly how a teenager wants to be seen.
Yeah,
That's what
they wanna have a conversation, right? They don't wanna be lectured. They wanna have that conversation with you, and they wanna
and
be
they
heard
want
in
to be.
that conversation.
They insist on having some say. Of course, they'd like to have final say, but they can't. But
Yeah.
that's the blurry line. But most teenagers will really appreciate being seen as growing up, and it's also in the meta message is this is how you've grown up, not by smoking dope, not by getting drunk. This is how you. This is what it means to be mature. This is very important, especially the emotional language part. I'll tell you why. If a grown, a temper tantrum in a 5-year-old, we expect they don't have the language. They upset, they're intense. We can handle a 5-year-old having a tantrum. A 17-year-old having a tantrum because they don't have the language. That's could be jail time. I mean, somewhere in between, they got to learn how to use their words, quote unquote. I saw two brothers, 9 and 7, and they were in my waiting room. I was talking to mom for a few minutes, and we heard a scuffle. Nothing big. But about a minute later, we hear a scream. So we go out there, waiting room, and there's the 9-year-old holding his arm like this in tears, crying. And the 7-year-old's looking like, uh-oh, I'm in big trouble. And mom, I'm observing this because I'm the psychologist, of course. And I'm observing this. Mom says, what happened? And the 9-year-old says, he bit me. And he takes out his arm, and his teeth marks on his arm. And his brother really bit him. And the mom, I felt so bad for the mom. Here she is in the psychologist's office, and her kids are fighting one another. She's mortified. And she turned to the younger one and she said, I told you to use your words. And the 7-year-old turned and said, Mom, I don't know how. And I said to Mom, that's where we need to go. That's what we need to work at. It was just a very dramatic example of what we're talking about, those assumptions that
Yeah.
parents make. Use your words as a skill. A grown up, I saw a teenager who was definitely afraid of his father. His father was an angry man. He would lash out. One time he came in and he was really happy. What? What happened? Well, I don't have to worry about my dad. What happened? Well, his dad had a business at home, and his customers would come and park on the street. And his neighbor across the way went up to the dad and said, Hey, your clients are taking up all our parking spaces. And they got into a row, and dad punched this guy. The guy fell back, hit the back of his head on the curb, and I had 3 young kids. Dad went to jail for 15 years. And the teenager felt relieved because he didn't have to deal with his angry dad. I mean, again, a very dramatic example of how important it is to develop an emotional language, to be able to handle intensity. It doesn't just happen because you're smart, you know, it doesn't just happen because you grow up. It's a skill that requires parents or if the parents are not good at it, you mentioned they may turn to other adults, and some of those adults are not the good people. But young children have a capacity called elasticity. In other words, if they can't get their emotional needs met from one source, they can transfer it to another source. Uncle
Mhm.
Billy, you know what I mean? Which is a good thing because sometimes parents are not capable or not available. The problem comes with that is when there's like a step parent, and that step parent becomes more the emotional parent than the original parent. That's not your dad. I'm your dad. Well, children with elasticity, they have no problem having two dads, but they also want to make sure their parents are okay so they can be okay. So they'll have to take a side. So they're not going to like stepdad. You know what I mean? Because dad doesn't like stepdad and he wants to make dad happy. And because if dad's happy with him, then he can be happy with himself. It's all part of self-esteem. So, it's like, okay, so I have to talk to, blended families about things like that.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's a whole nother
Yep.
rabbit hole to jump down together.
Well, there's a chapter in the book called on high conflict families because of stuff like this, divided loyalty, parent alienation, all those things I'm sure that you're familiar
Mhm.
with.
Yeah, I'd really like to get this wrapped up here, for time's sake, to respect your time, and a little bit of just to kind of lighten up the conversation a little bit right here at the end of the podcast. My listeners love entering the dad zone, so if you will, let's enter the dad zone together, which is 3 quick questions, or actually 4 technically quick questions, that I'll ask you to end the podcast. And these are some that I didn't send over to you with the intention of having some fun with them.
I also want to plug my website and my book, though. Remember
Yep,
that too.
we'll plug that at the very
But
end.
I appreciate that.
At the very end here. So, first question here in the dad zone. You're hosting a dinner party. You're inviting 3 people, dead or alive. Who are you inviting?
Okay, let me think about that for a second. All right. I'd invite my father, who passed away early, okay, because I miss him. My best friend, Norb, who's an amazing musician, and we are both psychologists and we have a lot in common, but a lot difference. He's creative in a Jungian way, and I'm creative in a more psychodynamic. I invite my wife, but she's very wise,
Love
you
it.
know.
Love it. What is your
And
guilty pleasure? Oh, go ahead.
no, my wife is very wise, and she's also very smart. I mean, I'm not dumb, but she's smarter than I am. What can I tell you? And the part that's hard about that, you're married, obviously, is that she's usually right, and I don't want her to always be right. Sometimes I like to be right, but all right. So those are the 3 people that I would.
Love it. What is your guilty pleasure food?
Food?
Yep,
Is that what you mean?
guilty pleasure food.
Why? I have to let you know I just lost 53 pounds.
Congratulations.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Mixture of pickleball, which I play religiously, and Ozempic, those shots that you take that help you lose weight. Those shots really work. What can I tell you? But anyway, my guilty pleasure food, that would have to be ice cream. Chocolate, fudge, ice cream. I can eat that by the gallon.
I
I could. In
love
fact, when
that.
I was in my 20s, I'd get a thing of a gallon of Breyer's vanilla fudge ice cream, and I'd wolf the whole thing down. Of course, it was a lot cheaper back then, too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then the second to last question here in the dad zone. Does pineapple go on pizza?
No,
No. Great. Perfect answer. And then
I'm sorry.
very
I've
last
tried
question
that.
here. No, it's a fun question that we've had on the podcast for a long, long, long time. What is one piece of advice that you would offer to a new dad, ages 18 to 22, that's just starting out his parent or his fatherhood journey? So just one piece of advice for him.
Okay, there are 3 things you're trying to accomplish at that age. All right. One is, what am I going to do? Where am I going to do it? And who am I going to do it with? All right. Those 3 are pressing questions that you really need to work at in order to be okay yourself. All right. So finding a decent job or getting the training for a decent job so that you don't come, doing something you don't like to do. You know, where? Hopefully someplace you get support. You know what I'm saying? With family or friends, whatever it is. A lot of these companies now move people around to move up the ladder. And I've seen families break up because they have no support in Houston. You know what I mean? Like that. And the third is, you know, who are you going to do it with? Well, that's a matter of finding that person you can make a haven with. And what I mean by that is the person you usually end up with is a person that somehow together you're better than the sum of your parts. You complement each other, not with the E, you know, somehow this person I can trust to really be there for me emotionally and physically, because that's the basis. I can predict this person because that's the basis of trust. When you can predict somebody, you trust them. It's also the basis of a child's security. Being able to trust your spouse will also help your children to be able to trust the two of you. That's where it ties in. So those are the three things that I would as objectives for people, young parents, young people.
Love that. So, David, this has been a great conversation, very insightful. Went pretty deep on some topics, so I enjoyed that myself. The best way for people to connect to you is that going to be parentrx.org.
That's my website. That's exactly right. It's called Parent RX, like parent prescription, and the subtitle Prescriptive Wisdom, Tips and Strategies for Communication with Your Child.
Love
Okay.
it.
That'll be the title of the book. They can reach me, and these podcasts, including this one, will be listed on my website.
To our listeners, go to parentrx.org. That's parentrx.org to explore more Dr. Marcus's work, insights, and access his parenting resources that can make a real difference in your home, including his forthcoming book here. And with that, make sure you go and give your kid a hug. Remember, we're not trying to be perfect parents. We're just showing up with presence, honesty, and love. Keep going forward. Keep moving forward. You're doing a great job. And until next time, we'll talk to you right here on the Young Dad Podcast.
Thank you.